The day my parents told me they had no money left for my college, I looked at the two framed graduation pictures hanging in our living room and realized something painful. They had found money for both of my siblings. They had sacrificed for them. They had celebrated them. But when it was finally my turn, somehow, there was nothing left. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply looked at my father and said, "Okay, I'll figure it out myself." What my parents didn't know was that the daughter they had overlooked for years would eventually become so successful that they would come looking for her again. But by then, I wouldn't need them anymore. Before we begin, make sure you stay until the end of this story, because what happened when my family finally came back into my life is something I never expected. And if you've ever felt like the forgotten child in your own family, you may understand exactly how I felt. My name is Danielle Carter, and I was the middle child in a family of 3. My older brother Marcus was 3 years older than me. My younger sister Jasmine was 2 years younger. Growing up, I always felt like I was caught between them. Marcus was the firstborn, so everything he did seemed important. Jasmine was the baby, so everyone protected her. And me? I was somewhere in the middle, constantly trying to prove that I deserved to be noticed too. My parents weren't cruel people. At least, that's what I used to tell myself. They worked hard, provided food, kept a roof over our heads, and made sure we went to good schools. But when it came to opportunities, I slowly realized that my siblings always seemed to come first. When Marcus wanted to play football, Dad paid for the equipment and the travel fees. When he needed a better computer for his classes, Mum and Dad bought him one. When Jasmine started taking dance lessons, they paid for her costumes, competitions, and private classes. I rarely asked for anything. Not because I didn't want things, but because I learned very early that asking usually ended with the same answer. Maybe later, Danielle. So I became the child who made do. If my shoes were still wearable, I wore them. If my phone worked, even though the screen was cracked, I kept it. If I needed something for school, I tried to find a way to get it myself. Nobody forced me to become independent. I simply realized that independence was easier than disappointment. But there was one thing I couldn't hide. I loved science. From the time I was a little girl, I was fascinated by the way things worked. While Jasmine was practicing dance routines in the living room, and Marcus was outside playing football, I was usually at the kitchen table with a notebook, drawing diagrams, and reading about things I barely understood. My chemistry teacher, Mrs. Thompson, noticed me when I was in high school. One afternoon after class, she stopped me before I left. "Danielle, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Have you ever thought about becoming a scientist?" I smiled. "All the time." She smiled back. "Then don't let anybody convince you that you can't." I carried those words with me. By my junior year, I was entering science competitions. By senior year, I had won several awards and received an acceptance letter from Hampton Ridge University, a respected university with an excellent science program. The day the letter arrived, I ran into the house holding the envelope. "Mum! Dad!" My mother came out of the kitchen. "What happened?" "I got in," she smiled. "Got into what?" "College." Dad walked into the room. "What college?" "Hampton Ridge." I handed him the letter. He read it slowly. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. Then Dad looked at Mum. That look should have warned me. "What?" I asked. Mum sat down. "Danielle, we need to talk." My excitement disappeared. "About what?" Dad placed the letter on the table. "College." "Okay. We've already spent a lot of money on Marcus." I nodded. "I know. And Jasmine is going to college next year too." "I know." Dad took a breath. "We just don't have enough left." I stared at him. "What do you mean? We can't afford to pay for your college." I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. "Wait. What?" Mum reached for my hand. "Sweetheart, it's nothing personal." Nothing personal. Those 3 words hurt almost as much as the rest. I looked from my mother to my father. But you paid for Marcus. We had to. And Jasmine, she's still our responsibility. I swallowed. And I'm not. Dad shook his head quickly. That's not what we're saying. But that was exactly what it felt like. I remembered the new football equipment they'd bought Marcus. I remembered the computer. I remembered Jasmine's dance classes and the expensive costumes. I remembered every time I'd been told to wait. And now, when it was finally my turn, they had nothing. I stood there quietly. My mother expected me to cry. Maybe she even expected me to argue. Instead, I picked up my college acceptance letter. Okay, I said. Dad looked surprised. Okay, I nodded. I'll figure it out. I walked upstairs before they could see the tears forming in my eyes. I closed my bedroom door and sat on the floor. For the first time, I allowed myself to cry. Not because I thought my parents owed me a perfect life. I cried because I had spent years believing that if I worked hard enough, they would eventually see me. But standing there with that acceptance letter in my hands, I finally understood something. They had seen me. They simply hadn't chosen me. That night, I called the one person I knew would listen. My grandmother. Grandma? What's wrong, baby? I tried to speak, but my voice broke. She immediately knew. Tell me. I told her everything. When I finished, there was silence on the phone. Then she said, "Come stay with me." I wiped my face. What? You heard me. Come stay with me. We'll figure this out. And that was the beginning of the life I built without my parents' help. The next morning, I started applying for scholarships, then jobs, then anything else that could help me pay for school. I didn't know it yet, but those difficult years would eventually lead me somewhere my parents never imagined. Because one day, they would see my name everywhere, and when they finally came looking for their daughter, I wouldn't be the same Danielle they had left behind. The weeks after my parents told me they couldn't pay for my college were some of the hardest weeks of my life. I applied for every scholarship I could find, whether it was a large national scholarship or a small local one. If the application was open, I filled it out. I spent hours writing essays about my grades, my love for science, and the future I wanted. But even after all those applications, I knew scholarships alone wouldn't be enough. So I got a job. There was a small cafe about 15 minutes from my grandmother's house, and they were looking for someone to work, mornings and weekends. I applied immediately, and when the manager looked at my application and asked if I was really planning to work while attending college, I told her I didn't have much of a choice. She smiled and said, "Then you'll probably be tired." I laughed and replied, "I already am." She hired me. A week later, I packed my things and moved into my grandmother's spare bedroom. I didn't have much to pack. A few clothes, my textbooks, my old laptop, and the acceptance letter from Hampton Ridge University were almost everything I owned. My grandmother stood in the doorway as I carried my last bag inside, and when I told her I was scared, she looked at me and said, "You're going to be okay, baby." I tried to smile and told her I hoped she was right, but she shook her head. "Don't hope," she said firmly. "Work for it." So that's exactly what I did. My first semester at Hampton Ridge was nothing like the college experience I had imagined. While other students were decorating dorm rooms, going out with friends, and enjoying their first months of freedom, I was counting every dollar in my bank account. My partial scholarship covered about 60% of my tuition, but the rest was my responsibility. I worked at the cafe before class, attended lectures during the day, then worked in the library in the evenings. Some nights, I didn't get home until after midnight. There were mornings when my alarm went off, and I wanted nothing more than to turn it off and stay in bed. But then I'd remember why I was doing it. I wasn't just trying to get a degree. I was trying to prove to myself that my parents hadn't been right to give up on me. One afternoon after my chemistry lecture, I stayed behind to speak with my professor, Dr. Carter. "Professor?" I asked as he gathered his papers. He looked up and said, "Yes, Danielle." I explained that I was looking for a work-study position in the chemistry department and told him about my science competitions, my high school projects, and the awards I had won. He listened carefully before telling me to come by his office the next morning. When I arrived, he offered me a position as a laboratory assistant. It wasn't glamorous work. I spent hours preparing equipment, organizing samples, cleaning glassware, and helping students during laboratory sessions. But I loved every minute of it because, for the first time, I was getting paid to do something connected to the career I wanted. Dr. Carter also started noticing things about me that nobody in my family had ever noticed. One afternoon, he told me, "You ask very good questions." I thanked him, and he continued, "Most students want the answer. You want to know why the answer is what it is." I smiled and told him that was probably why I loved chemistry. He nodded and said, "Don't lose that." I didn't. I started spending more time in the laboratory. I'd arrive early and leave late, and whenever I had a free moment, I was reading research papers and trying to understand problems that were far beyond my coursework. One evening, Dr. Carter found me still working. "Danielle, it's almost 10. I looked at the clock and realized he was right. He reminded me that I had been in the department since 8 that morning, and when I told him I'd leave soon, he shook his head. "You need to learn something important," he said. "Working hard is good. Destroying yourself isn't." I smiled and promised I'd remember that, although I didn't slow down much. I had spent my entire childhood feeling like I was behind everyone else, and now that I finally had a chance to catch up, I didn't want to waste it. My grandmother became my biggest source of support during those months. She never asked how much money I was making, never complained when I came home late, and never made me feel guilty for being exhausted. She simply made sure there was always something warm waiting for me. Sometimes I'd come home and find a plate covered with foil. Other times, I'd find a little note beside it saying, "Eat before you study," or "One day at a time," or simply, "Your grandmother is proud of you." Those little notes meant everything. Meanwhile, my family barely called. At first, I waited for them to check on me, but they didn't. My mother might send a short message once in a while, asking how school was going, and I'd answer, "Good," but the conversation usually ended there. My father didn't call at all. Marcus was busy with his own life, and Jasmine was preparing for college. Slowly, I stopped expecting them to care. Instead, I focused on myself. By the end of my first year, I had earned a 3.9 GPA. I was exhausted, but I was proud of what I had accomplished. Then Dr. Carter asked me to stay after a laboratory session. He told me there was a student research program starting that summer, and that he thought I should apply. When I opened the folder he handed me, I saw that the program focused on environmental chemistry and finding better ways to remove harmful chemicals from water. I immediately became interested because it was exactly the kind of work I wanted to do. I applied, and a few weeks later, I was accepted. The program was unpaid, which meant I still had to work at the cafe on weekends, but it gave me something more valuable than money: experience. For the first time, I wasn't simply studying chemistry. I was doing real scientific research. My project focused on finding a more efficient way to break down certain pharmaceutical compounds that were ending up in wastewater. The work was difficult, and my first experiment failed. So did the second. The third produced results that made absolutely no sense. I remember sitting in the laboratory staring at my notebook, frustrated and exhausted, wanting to throw the whole thing away. Instead, I started again. I changed the measurements, changed the conditions, tested different possibilities, and carefully recorded everything. Weeks later, I finally saw something that made me stop. The numbers were different. I checked them again, then again. They were real. My method was working. I ran to Dr. Carter's office with my notebook in my hands. "Professor!" He looked up and immediately knew something had happened. "What is it?" he asked. I told him I thought I had found something, and he carefully went through my notes and calculations. After several minutes, he looked at me and said, "Danielle, this could be significant." My heart started pounding. I asked if he really believed that, and he nodded. Then he told me I needed to present my work at the undergraduate research conference. Suddenly, the little girl who used to sit quietly at her family's dinner table, hoping someone would ask about her day, was going to stand in front of professors and researchers and explain her own scientific work. The night before the conference, I called my grandmother. "Are you ready?" she asked. I admitted that I wasn't sure. She reminded me of something my grandfather used to say: "Fear doesn't mean stop." I smiled and asked what it meant. She said, "It means what you're doing matters." I looked at my presentation one more time and then told her how grateful I was that she believed in me when nobody else did. She became quiet for a moment before saying, "That's what family is supposed to do." I didn't know it then, but those words would stay with me for years. The next morning, I walked into the conference room with shaking hands. There were professors, researchers, graduate students, and people much older and more experienced than me. I stood at the front, took a deep breath, and began. For the first few minutes, my voice shook, but then something changed. I started talking about my research, the questions I had asked, the problems I had faced, and the results I had discovered. And suddenly, I wasn't nervous anymore. I was talking about something I loved. When I finished, the room went quiet for a moment before someone started clapping. Then another person joined, and soon the entire room was applauding. I looked toward Dr. Carter, and he was smiling. After the presentation, several professors approached me. One asked about my research methods, another wanted to know what my next step would be, and then a woman I had never met walked toward me. She was wearing a navy suit and carrying a folder. "Danielle Carter?" she asked. I nodded. "I'm Dr. Helena Brooks. I've been listening to your presentation." She extended her hand and smiled. "I'd like to talk to you about an opportunity." I had no idea what she was about to offer me, but when she handed me her business card, I knew one thing: my life was about to change. Dr. Helena Brooks invited me to her office the following week, and I remember walking through the hallway trying to convince myself not to get too excited. She was a senior researcher at Harrington University, one of the most respected universities in the country, and the fact that she had personally asked to meet with me already felt unreal. When I entered her office, she smiled and motioned for me to sit. "I've reviewed your research," she said. "Your work is impressive, Danielle, especially considering you're still an undergraduate." I thanked her, still unsure where the conversation was going. She opened a folder on her desk and slid several papers toward me. "We have a research transfer program for exceptional students. You could transfer to Harrington University next year with a full tuition scholarship, housing included, and you'd work directly with our environmental chemistry research team." For a moment, I couldn't speak. A full scholarship, housing, access to laboratories I had only dreamed about. Everything I had been struggling to pay for was suddenly being offered to me because someone believed my work was worth investing in. "Why me?" I finally asked. Dr. Brooks smiled. "Because your research shows something I can't teach you. Curiosity. You don't just follow instructions. You want to understand why something works." I looked down at the folder, trying to hold back the tears forming in my eyes. Years earlier, my own parents had looked at my college acceptance letter and told me there was nothing left for me. Now, a woman who barely knew me was offering me an opportunity my family had refused to give me. I thanked her and told her I needed a little time to think, but deep down, I already knew what I wanted. The first person I called was my grandmother. "Grandma, I got an offer." She immediately asked what kind, and when I told her everything, she became quiet for a moment before laughing softly. "I knew it," she said. I laughed too. Knew what? She told me she had always known that one day other people would see what she had seen in me all those years. I told her it was a huge decision and that I was scared of leaving everything familiar behind. She reminded me that opportunities didn't always come when we were comfortable enough to accept them. Sometimes they came when we were terrified. "Make the decision that's best for your future," she told me. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the information Dr. Brooks had given me. I thought about my parents. For years, I had imagined them standing beside me at graduation, hearing about my research, watching me receive awards, and finally telling me that they were proud of me. But they had barely asked how I was doing. They hadn't seen the nights I worked at the cafe, the mornings I rushed to class, the hours I spent in the laboratory, or the countless times I stayed awake trying to understand something that refused to make sense. I had spent so much of my life wanting their approval that I hadn't realized I was slowly becoming someone who didn't need it anymore. So I accepted the offer. Moving to Harrington University was one of the scariest things I'd ever done. The campus was enormous. The laboratories were unlike anything I had ever seen, and some of the equipment cost more than I could imagine earning in several years. My classmates came from wealthy families, and many of them had grown up around doctors, professors, engineers, and business owners. At first, I felt like an outsider. I wondered whether I really belonged there. Then I reminded myself that nobody had handed me that opportunity. I had earned it. My first semester was difficult because Harrington's program was much more demanding than anything I had experienced before. I spent long hours in the laboratory, studied late into the night, and constantly pushed myself to understand more. My new research supervisor, Dr. Nathaniel Harris, was especially demanding. The first time I met him, he barely looked away from his computer. "You're Danielle Carter?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Dr. Brooks says you're talented." I thanked him, and he finally looked at me. "Talent isn't enough." I swallowed and nodded. "I know." He pointed toward the laboratory. "Good. Then show me what you can do." He pushed me harder than anyone ever had. If an experiment failed, he wanted to know why. If my data looked strange, he made me repeat the experiment. If I made an assumption without enough evidence, he sent me back to the research literature. There were nights when I left the laboratory frustrated and convinced that I wasn't good enough, but every morning I returned. Eventually, I stopped being afraid of criticism and started using it to improve. My research became stronger, my results became more consistent, and I began to understand that being challenged didn't mean I didn't belong. It meant someone expected me to become better. By the end of my second year at Harrington, I had contributed to a research paper with Dr. Harris. When the paper was published, I stared at my name on the page for several minutes. I called my grandmother immediately. "Grandma, my name is on a scientific paper." She screamed so loudly that I had to move the phone away from my ear. Then she started laughing and crying at the same time. I laughed too. "I wish you could see it," I told her. "I don't need to see it," she replied. "I can hear the smile in your voice." That night, something became clear to me. I wasn't chasing my parents' approval anymore. I was building a life that made me proud. The years passed quickly, and my work continued to grow. I presented my research at conferences across the country, traveled to places I had never imagined visiting, and met scientists whose names I had previously only seen in textbooks. One of my research projects received a national award, then another paper was published, and slowly, people started recognizing my name. My grandmother remained the one person who knew the entire story behind every achievement. She knew about the cafe, the tuition struggles, the nights I cried, and the rejection I had experienced at home. She knew how hard I had worked, and she never allowed me to forget where I came from. My parents, however, remained mostly absent. Occasionally, my mother would send a short message asking how I was doing, and I would politely reply that I was doing well. That was usually the end of the conversation. I didn't tell her about the research papers, the awards, the conferences, or the opportunities coming my way. I had stopped trying to convince people who had already decided not to see me. Then, during my final year at Harrington, everything changed. A national television network contacted the university because they were producing a documentary about young scientists changing the future of environmental research, and they wanted to feature me. When Dr. Harris told me, I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. "Are you serious?" I asked. "Very." I told him I wasn't sure I wanted the attention, but he explained that they weren't interested in me because of fame. They were interested because my work mattered, and because somewhere out there was a young person who needed to see someone who looked like them doing something they had never imagined possible. After thinking about it, I agreed. The film crew spent several days following me around the laboratory. They interviewed Dr. Harris and Dr. Brooks, filmed me conducting experiments, and asked me about my journey. For the first time, I spoke publicly about working at the cafe while attending college, and about the grandmother who had given me a place to stay when my parents couldn't or wouldn't help me. I didn't mention my parents. That part of my life was private, and I didn't feel the need to give them space in my story. When the documentary finally aired on a Thursday evening, I watched it alone in my apartment. Seeing my face on television felt surreal. The narrator described me as one of the country's promising young environmental scientists and showed clips of my research, my awards, my presentations, and my work in the laboratory. Near the end, they showed me speaking to a group of young students. One little girl raised her hand and asked, "What made you believe you could become a scientist?" I smiled before answering, "Someone believed in me before I knew how to believe in myself." I was talking about my grandmother, but I knew those words also described the difference between the person I had been and the person I had become. The program ended, and I turned off the television. For several seconds, my apartment was completely silent. Then my phone buzzed. I looked down and saw a message from an unknown number. "Danielle, it's Mum. We just saw you on television." I stared at the screen, almost unable to believe it. Another message appeared. "Your father and I are so proud of you." Then another. "We've always believed in you." I slowly placed my phone on the table. For years, I had waited for those words. I had imagined how happy I would be when my parents finally told me they were proud of me. But now that they were saying it, something inside me felt strangely empty. Before I could process it, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Marcus. "Little sis, congratulations. I had no idea you were doing all this." Then Jasmine sent her own message. "Danielle, we're all so proud of you. We should catch up soon." I stared at those messages for a long time. 3 years of silence. 3 years of barely asking how I was doing. And now that millions of people had seen my face, suddenly I was their little sister again. I didn't know it yet, but my family's return had nothing to do with the daughter they had finally discovered. They were coming back because they had seen what I had become, and soon I would find out exactly what they wanted from me. The messages from my family didn't stop after the documentary aired. At first, I ignored them because I didn't know what to say. My mother kept sending messages about how proud she was and how she wished she had known more about my work, while my father suddenly started asking questions about my research and my plans after graduation. Marcus sent me pictures of his children and asked if I could help his oldest daughter with a science project, and Jasmine began talking about how we had been apart for too long and needed to rebuild our relationship. I could have believed they genuinely wanted to reconnect if they had reached out before the cameras came, before the awards, before the television interviews, and before my name started appearing in places they could no longer ignore. But something about the timing bothered me. For years, they had barely asked how I was doing, and now they were suddenly acting as if I had always been the center of their world. I decided not to respond immediately, and instead I focused on finishing my final year at Harrington. My research was moving faster than I had expected, and Dr. Harris had begun discussing a possible position for me in his laboratory after graduation. Then, one afternoon, I received an email that changed everything. It was from the university's communications department, congratulating me on being selected for the Kingsley Young Scientist Award, one of the most respected awards given to young researchers in my field. I read the email twice because I couldn't believe it. I had worked for years for moments like that, but when I finally received one, the first person I wanted to call was my grandmother. She answered on the second ring, and when I told her the news, she started crying. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you," she said. I smiled through my own tears and told her that I wished he could have seen how far I had come. She reminded me that the people who truly loved me had been watching the whole time. The awards ceremony was held several weeks later, and for the first time in my life, I walked onto a stage, knowing that I had earned every bit of the applause I received. When they called my name, I looked into the audience and saw Dr. Harris, Dr. Brooks, several of my colleagues, and my grandmother sitting in the front row. I didn't see my parents, and strangely, I wasn't disappointed. I had finally stopped waiting for them. After the ceremony, I took pictures with my grandmother, and later that evening, I posted one of us together on my social media page. I wrote a simple caption, thanking the people who had believed in me when I had nothing but a dream. Within hours, the post began spreading, and that's when my mother called. I stared at her name on my screen for several seconds before answering. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end before she said, "Danielle, sweetheart, why didn't you tell us about the award?" I almost laughed because I didn't know how to explain that she hadn't given me a reason to tell her. "You didn't ask," I finally said. She became quiet. "We're your parents." I looked out the window of my apartment. "I know. She told me she and Dad wanted to come to my graduation and celebrate with me, and I asked why. She sounded offended by the question. "Because we're proud of you." I didn't argue, but I also didn't promise anything. My graduation was approaching, and I wanted it to be about the people who had helped me get there, not about repairing a relationship that had been broken for years. A few days later, I received another call, this time from my father. His voice sounded different from the confident voice I remembered growing up. He said he had been thinking about everything and realized that perhaps they hadn't treated me fairly. That was the closest he had ever come to admitting they had hurt me. I asked him why they had been willing to spend so much money on Marcus and Jasmine, but had told me there was nothing left. He didn't have a real answer. He talked about circumstances, finances, timing, and responsibilities, but none of those explanations changed what had happened. Then he said something that made me suspicious. "Your mother and I would really like to talk to you about the future." I asked what he meant, but he said it would be better to discuss it in person. I agreed to meet them after graduation, but I made it clear that I wasn't promising anything beyond a conversation. A week later, I graduated from Harrington University with honors, and my grandmother stood beside me in her best dress, crying harder than anyone else in the room. Dr. Harris attended the ceremony too, and afterward he pulled me aside and told me he had an opportunity he wanted to discuss with me. He offered me a full-time research position in his laboratory, the kind of position young scientists spent years hoping to receive. I accepted immediately. That evening, my grandmother hugged me and whispered, "You did it." I looked at her and realized she was right. I had actually done it. The little girl who had once sat alone at the kitchen table, wondering why she wasn't enough, had become a scientist with published research, awards, and a future she had built with her own hands. But while I was celebrating, my parents were preparing for their own return into my life. 2 days after graduation, They came to my apartment without telling me they were coming. When I opened the door and saw them standing there, I froze. My mother looked older than I remembered, and my father seemed strangely uncomfortable. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Finally, my mother smiled and said, "Can we come in?" I stepped aside, but I didn't hug them. They sat on the couch while I remained standing across from them. My father cleared his throat and said, "We came because we want to make things right." I crossed my arms. "What does that mean?" My mother started crying almost immediately, telling me she regretted the way things had happened, and that she never wanted me to think they loved me less than my siblings. I listened quietly, but then my father reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "There's something else we need to talk to you about." I looked at the paper, then at him, and in that moment, I realized the conversation wasn't really about my childhood, my pain, or the years they had missed. There was something they wanted from me, and whatever it was, I knew it was about to change the way I saw my family forever. My father unfolded the paper slowly and placed it on the coffee table between us, and for a moment, I simply stared at it without touching it. "What is this?" I asked. He exchanged a glance with my mother before answering. "It's about the house." I frowned. "What about it?" My father explained that their mortgage had become difficult to manage, that some unexpected expenses had piled up, and that they were worried they might lose the house they had lived in for years. I listened quietly, waiting for the part that actually concerned me. Then my mother reached for my hand, but I pulled mine back. "Danielle, we know you're doing very well now, and we were hoping you might be able to help us." There it was, the real reason they had come. I looked at both of them and almost laughed because I suddenly remembered the night they had looked me in the eyes and told me there was nothing left for my education. They had been able to pay for Marcus. They had been able to prepare for Jasmine. But somehow, when it was my turn, there had been nothing. Now they were sitting in my apartment, asking me to help save the same family that had left me to figure out my own future. "How much?" I asked. My father told me the amount, and I felt my stomach tighten. It wasn't a small favor. They were asking for enough money to cover a significant part of their financial problems, and when I asked whether Marcus and Jasmine were helping, my mother immediately said they were struggling too. I nodded slowly. "So you came to me." My father looked uncomfortable. "You're in a better position than they are." I leaned back and looked at them carefully. "Do you know what I remember most about the day I told you I got into college?" Neither of them answered. I remember how excited I was. I remember holding that acceptance letter. I remember thinking that finally, after everything I'd done, you were going to be proud of me. And then you told me you didn't have anything left. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Danielle, we made a mistake." I shook my head. "No, Mum. You made a decision." She started crying harder, telling me that she had always loved me and that she never wanted me to believe she had chosen my siblings over me. But love without action had never felt like love to me. I told her that I wasn't angry because they couldn't give me everything I wanted. I was hurt because they had given my siblings opportunities while teaching me not to expect any. They had watched me struggle, watched Grandma take me in, and then barely checked on me. They hadn't seen the nights I worked until I could barely stand. They hadn't seen me studying on buses, working weekends, or sitting alone in laboratories wondering whether I was wasting my time. They hadn't seen any of it. But now that the struggle was over and the results were visible, they wanted to be part of the story. My father lowered his head. "We were wrong." I believed that he finally understood what he had done, but then he said something that made me realize he still didn't completely understand. "But you're our daughter. Family should help family." I looked at him and said quietly, "I agree. Family should help family." I paused. "That's why Grandma helped me." My mother stopped crying. I continued. "When you couldn't help me, she did. When I had nowhere to go, she opened her door. When I didn't know how I would pay for school, she told me to keep going. When I was exhausted, she made sure I ate. When I succeeded, she celebrated me. That's family." Neither of them said anything. The room became painfully quiet. Finally, my mother asked the question I had been expecting. "So you're really not going to help us?" I took a deep breath before answering. "No." My father's face hardened. "After everything we've done for you?" I couldn't believe he had said it. Everything you've done for me? I repeated. You gave me a home when I was a child. You fed me. You raised me. I appreciate that. But you didn't build my career. You didn't pay for my education. You didn't sit beside me when I was working 3 jobs. You didn't stay awake with me when I thought I was going to fail. You didn't drive me to my research conferences. You didn't stand beside me when I received my awards. Grandma did. My professors did. My mentors did. And I did. My father looked away. My mother whispered that she had hoped graduation would bring our family back together. I told her that graduation hadn't separated us. Their choices had. There was a difference. She asked if I hated them, and that question almost broke my heart, because the truth was more complicated than hate. I didn't hate them. I had simply stopped needing them. I told her, I spent years wishing you would come back for me. I don't wish for that anymore. She covered her face and cried. My father stood up, looking defeated, and said they would leave. Before they reached the door, I stopped him. Dad. He turned around. I'm not giving you the money, but I'm not going to pretend you never existed either. If one day you genuinely want a relationship with me, without money, without favors, without asking me to fix something for you, then maybe we can talk. He stared at me for a long moment and nodded. They left without another word. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and relief. I had imagined this moment so many times, but I had always imagined myself screaming, demanding answers, or finally making them understand how much they had hurt me. Instead, I felt calm. I had finally said everything I needed to say. The next morning, I went to the laboratory and returned to my research. Life continued. My new position with Dr. Harris officially began, and my work started receiving even more attention. I bought my first small house, not a mansion, not anything extravagant, but a home that belonged entirely to me. The first picture I hung on the wall wasn't one of an award or a graduation ceremony. It was a picture of Grandma and me standing together outside the laboratory on the day I received my first major research award. She had been there from the beginning, and she deserved to be there at the end, too. A few months later, I received a letter from my mother. I almost threw it away, but something made me open it. This time, there was no request for money, no mention of their house, and no excuse. She simply apologized. She admitted that they had treated me differently, that they had convinced themselves they were doing what was best for the family, and that they hadn't realized how deeply their choices had hurt me. I read the letter twice and put it away. I didn't know whether I was ready to forgive them, but for the first time, I realized I didn't need to decide immediately. I had spent years rushing to prove myself. Now, I could take my time. I could choose what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with the people who had once made me feel like I didn't matter. And that was the greatest thing my success had ever given me. Not money, not awards, not recognition, the freedom to finally choose my own life. For the first time in my life, I stopped measuring my worth by how much attention my family gave me. I had spent years wondering why Marcus seemed to matter more, why Jasmine always received the kind of support I had quietly wished for, and why my parents couldn't see how badly I wanted them to believe in me. But standing in my own home, surrounded by the life I had built, I finally understood that their inability to recognize my value had never meant I didn't have any. I had simply been looking for validation from people who were incapable of giving me what I needed. My grandmother remained a huge part of my life, and every Sunday we had dinner together whenever our schedules allowed. Sometimes we talked about my research, sometimes we talked about ordinary things, and sometimes we sat quietly, enjoying each other's company. One evening, while we were eating, she looked around my house and smiled. "Your grandfather would be amazed if he could see this." I smiled back. "I wish he could." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "He would tell you the same thing I've been telling you all these years." I laughed. "What?" She smiled. "You were never forgotten. You were just being prepared for a life bigger than the one you imagined." Her words stayed with me. I eventually responded to my mother's letter, but I didn't pretend everything was suddenly okay. I told her that I appreciated her apology and that I was willing to take small steps toward rebuilding a relationship, but I made it clear that there would be boundaries. There would be no more asking me for money, no guilt, no pretending the past hadn't happened, and no using the word family whenever they wanted something from me. If we were going to have a relationship, it had to be based on honesty and respect. My mother agreed. My father didn't respond immediately, but several months later, he sent me a message of his own. It was short. He said he was sorry, and that he finally understood that being my parent didn't automatically give him a place in the life I had built. I read the message several times before replying. Thank you for saying that. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't a reunion, but it was a beginning. Marcus and Jasmine eventually reached out too, and those conversations were even more complicated because they had grown up believing that everything in our family was normal. They hadn't understood what it felt like to be the child constantly told to wait. I didn't blame them for receiving opportunities I didn't receive, but I also wasn't going to pretend their experience and mine had been the same. I told them that I didn't want resentment between us, but I needed them to understand why I had stepped away. Slowly, carefully, we began rebuilding our relationships on different terms. Some days were uncomfortable, some conversations ended with silence, but for the first time, nobody was pretending. Meanwhile, my career continued moving forward. My research team developed a promising new approach to treating contaminated water, and the project attracted attention from environmental organizations and universities around the country. I was invited to speak at conferences and universities, and one afternoon, I found myself standing in front of a room filled with young black students who were interested in science. I looked at those students and remembered the girl I used to be, sitting alone at a kitchen table with a notebook, wondering whether anyone would ever take her dreams seriously. After my presentation, a young girl approached me. She looked nervous as she held out a notebook. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I smiled. "Of course." She asked what I should do if my family didn't believe in my dreams. For a second, I couldn't speak, because the question took me straight back to my childhood. Then I told her the truth. "Keep going. Sometimes the people closest to you won't understand your vision, and that can hurt, but their doubt doesn't decide your future. Find people who will encourage you. Learn everything you can, work hard, and never allow someone else's lack of belief to become your own." She smiled and thanked me before walking away. I watched her disappear into the crowd, and I realized that perhaps this was part of why I had gone through everything. Not because the pain was necessary, but because I could now use what I had learned to help someone else avoid giving up on herself. Years earlier, my parents had told me there was nothing left for me. They thought they were closing a door, but they didn't realize I would learn how to build my own. I had gone from a young woman working long shifts at a cafe and worrying about tuition to a scientist with a career I loved, a home of my own, published research, and people around me who genuinely valued who I was. I didn't become successful to prove my parents wrong. In the beginning, maybe a small part of me did, but eventually, I realized the greatest victory wasn't making them regret their decision. It was reaching a place where their regret no longer mattered. I could forgive them without forgetting. I could love them from a distance if that was what gave me peace. I could allow them back into my life slowly, or I could change my mind if they crossed the boundaries I had worked so hard to establish. My success belonged to me. My story belonged to me. And so did my future. Looking back now, I sometimes think about that young woman, standing in her parents' kitchen, holding a college acceptance letter, hearing 6 painful words, "We don't have anything left for you." At the time, I thought those words meant my dreams were over. I didn't know they were actually the beginning. Because when they told me they had nothing left to give me, I discovered something they could never take away. I had determination. I had talent. I had my grandmother's love. I had mentors who saw something in me. And most importantly, I had myself. So if you're listening to my story because you feel like the forgotten child in your own family, I want you to remember this. Being overlooked does not mean you are worthless. Being unsupported does not mean you are incapable. And someone else's decision not to invest in you does not mean you should stop investing in yourself. Sometimes the people who are supposed to believe in you won't. Sometimes the people you expect to celebrate you won't even notice what you're becoming. But keep going. Build your life anyway. Find your people. Protect your peace. And when you finally reach the place you've been fighting for, Don't waste your success trying to make the people who doubted you understand your worth. You will already know it. I am Danielle Carter, and for the first time in my life, I can say this without hesitation. My life is finally mine.